broadly to address our issue, we would need approximately $500,000. There are pools of money that we have found to be available and utilized in other parts of the country, such as the Victims of Crime Act funding, but because of the rules here in Georgia about how those funds can be applied, we don't have access to those funds to grow the capacity of our programs or to better serve our patients. And a public health point on this is that what you may hear referred to as the victim offender overlap, in that many of the individuals we see in the hospitals with firearm-related injuries are in some way or do end up becoming perpetrators of gun violence. And it's very difficult to see a person who is an offender as also a victim. And so through our research and programs like Pivot, we're able to contextualize the nature of that overlap by getting an understanding of what fuels that cycle besides it being environmental. So I offer an example, just food for thought, in that a patient who has endured a firearm-related injury is now traumatized by having been shot, not knowing maybe who the perpetrator was, coming to a hospital and being near death, and unsure of who they can trust. These kinds of behaviors, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, all of these things set in and directly inhibit their ability to function normally in their communities. They often arm themselves then to feel secure and safe. And carrying a firearm statistically increases the likelihood of an individual being shot. And so the cycle continues in that a person who is then armed is likely to be shot, or they arm themselves because they want to retaliate or just to feel safe, and things go wrong. And because of the block of support and resources needed to decrease the risk factors associated with communities who experience violence, the cycle persists. So the goal of the public health perspective is to interrupt violence as if it is an infectious disease, a contagion that spreads from person to person, as it does. Once a person is shot, they are likely to retaliate or to feel unsafe, and it spreads across the community. And so we're hoping to interrupt that by actually providing mental health support, housing, employment, job training to help mitigate all of those risk factors that are associated with communities experiencing the highest levels of violence. Though it can often be construed that our efforts to this end have something to do with infringing on Second Amendment rights. And these things they don't go hand in hand at all. It is my personal position, not the position of Pivot, that we do need more specific legislation around gun control and firearms, but the goal of my job as a professional, as a public health professional and of the hospital, is to reduce the number of injuries that we're seeing, to reduce the overall burden of death, and to help communities that we serve in other ways, whether it be chronic disease, diabetes, overutilization of emergency departments, access to health care overall. We address violence in that same manner to support communities and increase the quality of life by decreasing years of life lost to injury and violence.
Wow. Bam! Drop mic. I have to interrupt right now and ask you one question, and that is, would you please tell us what is the strongest or loudest or most quoted objection to seeing violence as though it were an infectious disease?
The one that I've heard the most is that violent people are violent people and they can't be changed.
Got it.
And therefore, there's no point in devoting resources to supporting individuals or communities that experience or perpetrate violence.
Got it. Thanks, Jasmine. We're going to come back to you. Mayor Margaret, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Go.
Well, I'm in the wild mode too right now. Gun violence is a public health issue. My answer to why it's not treated as a public health issue is politics. Politics.
Come on in, Matt.
Politics.
I think he's going to help us hear you better.
I did something bad.
Yeah, bad girl.
Am I okay now? My answer to the
Thanks,
question
Matt.
of why gun violence is not a public health issue is politics. And that's quite unfortunate. I'm also fascinated by the hotspot of data. You know, we have hotspot of data on child abuse. I could pull up a map for you on Fulton County to show you where hotspots of child abuse. So the data collection, the public health discussion is all very familiar to me. And as I try to move those discussions into the world of politics, I hit some bumps in the road. I've had a long political career, and I will tell you that in my political career, when I was in the Senate in a leadership position when the Democrats were in charge about 20 years ago, we had a much more bipartisan discussion about gun violence. I only use the word gun violence and safety. I never use the word gun control. And even though the gun safety people were not prevailing a lot, we did have a violence discussion about guns, and we did have a bipartisan discussion. And with me in the Senate in the 90s was Johnny Isaacson and David Scott, both of whom are national leaders, along with Sonny Perdue at this point. Today, in the Georgia political world, which is very different than the Vermont political world I was hearing about on the radio as I drove down, guns are a hyper-partisan political issue. And the dialogue is not bipartisan, and it is quite unfortunate. Despite that, we are, even in our polarized and divisive little communities in the Georgia political world, there are a lot of ideas that we put forward. And I'm going to suggest to you a couple of different ways that I think there are some of these ideas that can be moved forward in a more positive way. Elections matter, votes matter, and depending on what happens in 2020 and depending upon the public mood that is quite, I think, growing with financing for the gun safety crowd, I think we do have some opportunities to shift some of these discussions in a positive way. One of the reasons I gave you this handout today is to show you that in our Public Safety and Homeland Security Committee, which is a large, important committee, it has probably 50 bills assigned to it this first year of our two-year session in 2019. Over half of the bills on page 1 and 2 relate to guns. And I had about 30. And one of the reasons I wanted to give you this list of bills, I have several reasons to kind of burden you with these papers, is I want you to know that one of the big changes in my political life is that every single thing is available to you that you might want to ever know about what's happening with your personal representative and your personal senator in the Georgia General Assembly is available to you online from your home in your bunny slippers on your computer. You do not have to go to the world of Marble. You do not have to go to the world of lobbyists. You are invited, strongly invited and encouraged to use these online tools to the extent you'd like to become more knowledgeable. In our partisan world, the Democrats of the House organized to introduce 10 gun safety bills. All of the issues that are supported by the public in any polling data, universal background checks, issues relating to specifically the two most prominent issues that I really thought would pass, marrying up the Georgia definition of domestic violence with the federal definition of domestic violence that would prevent a person convicted or engaging in domestic violence from purchasing a gun. That is a fairly common sense, reasonable implementation of a policy that I thought really would have a chance to pass, and it didn't. And the other most promising is that somehow, I don't remember exactly when this happened, the General Assembly passed a law that said your mental health records, specifically you have been determined to be incapacitated and in need of some specific intervention through a probate court action, will be eliminated after 5 years, and so after 5 years, those mental health records are no longer a barrier to purchase of guns. Those two, very, very easy to understand and easy to pass, I really thought would pass this year and did not. The most extreme example of a bill that will not pass in Georgia is the ban on assault weapons. Although that is also supported by the public in Georgia. When I tell you data, I'm talking about polling in Georgia. Ban of assault weapons I introduced in 17 and 18, which generated, not only for me, but my first introduction of it was all women that signed the bill, about 30 of us. Generated 3,000 messages from the other crowd, that's more on the Second Amendment talking points, and they were not pleasant messages. And I did not introduce it this year, and it was not introduced in our 10 package as a way to kind of try to take away the big bad bill that they really don't like, assault weapon bans, and move to more reasonable kinds of discussions. Texas has passed a mandatory training bill, which would allow you to have a gun at a certain level of registration. We are at a very difficult spot in relation to having meaningful discussions, helpful discussions on gun safety. What is going to change that is the public's acknowledgement and belief and acceptance from you that your representatives need to represent your views. If you do not know who your House member is or who your state senator is, please don't tell me that, because it would upset me a lot. But you are represented by two people at least, who need to hear from you on this issue. And it may be that if you live in the neighborhoods that I live and All Saints, my friends at All Saints live, it might be that your folks are very sensitive to the reality that gun violence is a significant public health issue, and we can do a lot better if we wanted to. Let me give you one little factoid that was meaningful to me. I have always thought that my vulnerability to an accidental death was cars. And 20-ish years ago, there were only 7 states where gun violence killed more people than cars. Today in Georgia, and about 23 states, gun violence kills more people than cars. As we drive home today, it's not somebody going through a light and T-boning you that you're most vulnerable. You're most vulnerable being shot and killed by a gun. There upwards presidential candidates now are saying pushing 40,000 gun violence deaths a year. And in Georgia, it's between 1,500 and 2,000. And there is a murder-suicide in Georgia, I want to say every weekend. And most of those every weekend murder-suicides leave children. In my law practice, I've represented 6 children who have been orphaned based on murder-suicide in 3 different families. We are not talking about the reality of preventable deaths from the mentally ill people, from the children, or from the criminals. And our discussion, to the extent it's going to move our political folks to do better job, I think the listening and the discussion about guns in the hands of children, the mentally ill, and criminal convicted individuals should be our most logical place and our most helpful place to go. And it's how I choose to talk about gun violence in most of my discussions. We can do a better job. We can prevent these deaths. And as you probably know, the best way to prevent these preventable deaths is to focus on the reality that over 60% of gun deaths are a result of suicide. really
Bless you.
65% a result of suicides. And if we could gather our political will together and talk about guns in terms of most of the people who die of guns at their own hand, it might be an opportunity to have a discussion that'll steer the discussion towards prevention and towards public health and away from the hyper-politicalization of gun legislation. I look forward to your questions. I'm interested in how you believe your discussions with your representative and your senator might be positive for you. I think I just dropped something.
I'll get it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Remember, before we turn to the Episcopal Church's responses, I want to revisit this notion of 3 pieces of legislation that were defeated that we might otherwise think would pass, and that is related to domestic violence, mental health, and assault weapons ban. So can you just articulate for us, I have one more question after this for you. Could you articulate for us the most energetic defense or reason for defeating these bills?
Politics.
I get it.
There is a
Unpack that, please.
There are multiple Second Amendment advocacy groups. There's not one. The NRA is one, and it's big. And in first time in my political career, the NRA is not better funded than the gun violence prevention crowd. And that we can thank Mayor Bloomberg for that more than anything else. The NRA is seen as the establishment and the Bigfoot and the Meanfoot and the nationally successful entity that politically has taken this issue in the way of hyperpartisanship. But there are at least 2 other gun groups that are more Georgia-based that are competitive at a very high level with the NRA to suggest, which they do publicly frequently, the NRA is a bunch of wimps, and you need to listen to me, because I'm the real guy that's going to protect you from Mary Margaret Oliver, and they unfortunately use my name. And they are grassroots, I don't want to say they're, see, I shouldn't say this, but they really, they're not all guys that live in their mother's basement with a computer, you know, they're not all that. They have networks, Georgia Carry and then Georgians for Gun, for the Second Amendment, the 2 names of these 2. They're small. Georgia Carry is a growing more fierce. The NRA is a bunch of wimps. We really are the ones. And then there's this subgroup who really is kind of an odd collection of people. I used to be a judge at the jail on the weekends and used to have to make decisions about whether somebody was criminally stalking or criminally, and these people are in that category of mixed evidence about whether or not they criminally stalk people and criminally harass people. And they are effective at terrorizing. One of the very, very strong Second Amendment, very, very conservative young man from North Georgia, which is frequently where these pockets are, came to me and apologized to me. He said, before, as I was just introducing the assault ban, he says, I'm really sorry about what they're going to do to you on this. I mean, and he was afraid for himself. He was being very courteous to me, but he was also afraid for himself.
What's that group's name? Never mind.
Never mind.
So
They have a couple of names, but it's...
Got it. So do either of you have off the top of your head how many Georgians die of gun violence every day or every year? Do we know that figure?
I don't have that statistic.
It's about 1,400 a year,
year?
so that's 3 a day.
Okay.
Most of whom, 65-ish%, are suicides.
Thank you. Let's talk about the Episcopal Church. Elizabeth, please.
Sure. Matt, there we go. So in 2015, you have this paperwork in front of you. General Convention met, and on the 50th anniversary of the murder of seminarian Jonathan Daniels, who was working in the civil rights movement and who was murdered by a white supremacist through gun violence, On the 50th anniversary, General Convention passed this resolution that urged all legislatures at the federal, state, and local levels to help decrease gun violence by implementing laws that require permits to carry concealed weapons and criminal background checks for every gun purchase, including those made at gun shows. With the exception of for military use or law enforcement agencies, to ban the sale and transfer, importation, and manufacture of military-style assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, and to also ban the importation and manufacture of full auto conversion kits that convert guns into automatic weapons.
Bump stocks.
To tighten laws against gun trafficking, to prohibit persons from purchasing guns without evidence of gun safety training, and to recognize the importance of existing inheritance laws on the transfer of gun ownership, and finally, to promote the funding for research into the prevention and causes of gun violence. So that is the resolution that was passed in 2015 by our church.
And 1 through 5 have been introduced in Georgia General Assembly. 6 and 7, the elimination of the ability of CDC to do research on gun violence was a very significant act. And that's a federal issue, number 7 here.
Before we go to general questions, let's go back to that very issue just now. Not all experts like you are free to come to this church and talk about the public health lens. Can you unpack that a little bit, please?
Unpack it in the
Why?
way. Why?
What goes on? What's the political conversation, the philosophical conversation about banning or talking that way and even getting some research done?
Okay. This has actually been really interesting for me personally, as with other programs and some of our efforts around general violence prevention, such as the Cardiff model, we have worked in partnership with the Centers for Disease Control on the implementation of that. They performed the original evaluation on the Wales implementation, and as long as we're addressing and looking at violence as a whole, CDC has capacity to do that. And being that this is, I'm still an early career professional, I felt really motivated and energized by having the CDC, not only in our very own backyard, but at the table for something that was so important. And with the newest administration, I learned that there were suddenly many things that our CDC partners couldn't say or do or participate in. They couldn't join us in calls. They couldn't come to the table just to even hear about what's going on right here in Atlanta. Once we started rolling with Pivot, the talk about gun is suddenly just better safe than sorry, completely backed away from the table. And so as far as unpacking that, I think it's powerful to see the medical community rallying to affect change at their locus of control, because they can be here. As a public health professional, it is commonplace for us to collaborate with the community, with churches, with nonprofit organizations, and what have you, to facilitate important conversations and affect change. And if we rely on the federal entities whose hands are bound, we'll be that much further from our goals. So I think it's great that I'm perfectly poised in the middle of professionals who want to affect change and having enough research experience to collect the valuable data so that when that door is lifted on CDC research, we can push forward with all the information we've gathered thus far.
I like your voice of hopefulness there, that when it's lifted. Mayor Margaret, I want to hearken back to another thing you talked about, and that is you invoked the names of our brothers, Isaacson and Scott, about there was a day of bipartisanship that was in support of this. Is there a correlation between that day and the openness to do the kind of research that Jasmine is interested in.
The correlation, yes, the correlation is also relating to the way the political, the use of guns as a political weapon has been developed as a strategy. I am hopeful, by the way, that the congressional discussion about funding gun violence prevention will move a little bit forward on this. Of course, everything depends on elections. I'm going to repeat that. Your vote matters. But I am a little hopeful about that. There is a much higher level discussion going on. But it is, Art Kellerman, I believe, was a member of this church. And it was during his era when he was doing so much of fascinating work through Grady and through a number of different health advocacy, including CDC, that amendment was passed in Congress that eliminated and shut down all of that. And I remember that very clearly. It's had a significant impact.
Thank you. So we now want to go to you, please. And I just want to simply reemphasize that we're here for both content and process. So all of your questions are welcome. If you want more information from these two resources, please, please, please raise your hand, get the microphone, and ask those questions. If you want to express an opinion that differs from theirs or mine, we want this room to be a safe room where absolutely everybody can object or dissent, have a different opinion. So if your heart is beating fast, that means the Holy Spirit's called on you to speak first. So raise your hand, and let's see what kinds of comments or challenges that we have. We'll go to Bill first, thanks.
I've heard some conversation about the NRA being very active in political contributions. Can somebody comment on that?
They're politically active in contributions at a very, very high, significant level.
At national and local level?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, hi, good morning. Do either of you shoot?
I have before.
You have, okay.
I have before. I don't own a gun now or don't
Okay.
shoot now.
All of my family does.
Well, and great. I've got a lot of military background. I fully believe we ought to have some kind of a safety training thing.
Mm-hmm.
It just amazes we don't in this state. I do have a carry permit. I've got a lot of friends that have carry permits. When I was in South Carolina, you couldn't get it without that training, and there are a lot of states that have that. So we don't have necessarily a reciprocity law that follows that because we don't have that. And you'd think that would be an emphasis that would cause this. But one of the things I didn't hear mentioned is, and I have medical friends, some at Grady, vascular surgeon, all that, we get to see some people that come in. Part of what is going on seems to be that there's not a family-based belonging, if you will. People like to belong to things. If you don't have a strong family background, you're going to look maybe for another group or entity to belong to. And kids sometimes find other kids and they get into these groups and they get into mischief, and maybe that turns into a worse type of thing later. We call them gangs, if you will. There's a lot of things that go on in Atlanta that you don't hear about on the news, though, that they do see at the hospitals and whatever. And so this gang-on-gang violence and stuff makes its way known into it. So I think we ought to be also looking at the family organization, not just, guns per se, but what causes that use. Maybe it's, getting into the gang thing. And, I go to the range sometime and you see these guys going like this, doing the thing they see on TV and the video thing, and you get killed in a video game, you get right back up again. You get a new life, do-over. Well, that doesn't work in life, as we know. So focusing on some of that might help. I have a daughter who's a single parent, but luckily I've been able to help participate in the raising of my grandchild. So, and he's doing pretty well, although he's a teenager, and that's another issue we gotta deal with. And then finally, for the group, AR is not assault rifle.
I know that.
An assault, those things, they look scary, but it's got a kind of a military-looking hand grip and the barrel thing. But they fire singly, just like the other rifles that you use. So make sure we understand what AR and assault rifle really means. Multi-fire clips like I shot in the military. Machine gun types or short barrel shotguns, so you can get a quick splatter or what have you like that. Otherwise.
So what's our word for the multiple da-da-da-da-da?
Well, automatic.
Okay. So A doesn't stand for automatic and
AR does not.
is assault.
It's not assault rifle.
It was the name of a
It's
manufacturer.
manufactured, yeah.
Got
It's
it.
gotten confused with that.
That's very, very, thank you so much.
House Bill 361 is the bill that was introduced in the Georgia General Assembly to require training before you get a carry permit.
So let's keep on with the training issue, because that's very, very important. My son runs a training school for people who buy motorcycles. And there's nothing comparable, I think, right, for,
There's nothing comparable in Georgia, and there are many states that have taken steps to implement some training requirements in order to either have a carry permit or a purchase.
so the proposal of the training legislation, that has been defeated regularly as well?
No, none of the 10 bills, and one of the bills that I introduced in the 10 package was high capacity and bump stock devices. None of those bills were allowed to have a hearing in 2019 on the House side. On the Senate side, there was a hearing on Senator Jen Jordan's bill about domestic violence.
So Jasmine, do you want to weigh in here on this one issue about training and public health, or is that?
Certainly. I think that the training is essential. It should be key. It should be standard. It's common sense. But I will also say that it only helps us affect a small section, well, not small, but a part of the breadth of gun violence as we see it, especially when it pertains to domestic violence or unintentional injury, suicide prevention. It affects legally acquired firearms. But if you think about community violence, often those firearms are not acquired legally. They are not purchased from a dealer. They are bought and sold on the street, or more importantly, in Georgia, they're stolen from cars. Here in Atlanta, that happens a lot.
700 handguns stolen from cars in the city of Atlanta.
So that has, the safety piece, the training, won't affect the community violence piece so much as it will the other very important aspects of firearm-related injury we need to prevent, but it won't cover it all. But it's a starting point.
Can you also speak to his point about belonging and family in terms of
Gangs.
environmental violence?
Absolutely. So we are pursuing funding right now to try to identify youths who are at risk for being involved in gang violence or who have been victims of gang violence. And I think that it's important to hone in on that, especially with Atlanta having a unique position and relationship with the formation of gangs. They're not traditional as one might say, and that you've heard of Bloods and Crips and so on. Here it's kids who get together and they form their own little subsection, and the ideas and loyalties, mentalities that we're used to around gangs don't really apply in Atlanta. And I do think that we need to have a better understanding of that. There's much research and much collaboration needed to really understand that issue and do something about it. But I think there are systemic issues that cause that lack of belonging to exist in the first place. Single parent households, poverty, blight, and decreased access to resources, wages that are not livable, what have you. And so it takes a village to raise a kid, but often the village is not prepared or has the capacity to do so, and so the kids do what they feel like they have to do, what they've known, what they've seen, what they can do.
And it takes a state to transform communities, right?
Absolutely.
Somebody has a question?
So, what I was curious about is I constantly get calls to support my
Gail, do
police.
you mind standing, my
I
friend?
can't, yeah.
I constantly get calls to support my police department. Well, I give it to this and that. So one day I said, where do you stand on gun control? Because there's so many policemen in this city. There are so many policemen in this country. And they're the ones that are so often victim of gun violence, along with everybody else. But I was just wondering, in this immediate community, how your interactions with the police are and what they do to contribute to these legislative issues on gun control.
Great question.
Great question.
Both of you, please.
A point that I frequently make, and you just reminded me, that the folks that are absent from the discussion in the Georgia General Assembly on gun violence issues is law enforcement. And that was not true when this discussion was happening 20 years ago. And I'll give you one specific example. A bill that I introduced in the 90s that has been reintroduced this year by Senator Donzella James requires pawn shops and gun sellers to secure their guns when the store is closed. That bill came to me in the 90s from law enforcement in Gwinnett County that had specific evidence that the truck that drives into the front of the, and I'll use pawn shop, to steal the 20 guns in 5 minutes out of the glass cases was organized crime in connection with the gun store owner. It was a method of facilitating the fact that Georgia at that time was the #1 gun runner state from guns from the South being stolen and sent to New York for the purpose of profit. There was an organized crime aspect to that. Now, every time I see the 6 o'clock news or the AJC today, and I see a truck that ran into the store of a pawn shop or a gun store, I ask myself, I wonder if there are still law enforcement folks working on that. When I introduced the assault weapon bill, Bishop Rob Wright came to my press conference. Law enforcement leaders of Atlanta Public Police Department promised they would be there and canceled 1 hour before, and DeKalb County Police, which I personally visited in their little offices, said we can never come to gun discussions in the Georgia General Assembly. Big change than what it used to be.
And just speak to the reason of the change, and then I want to ask Jasmine to talk about law enforcement.
Politics. Bad politics, not good politics. You have a choice to engage in both, or either.
Got it. Law enforcement.
Law enforcement. So with regard to the programs that we've been implementing, we've had excellent collaboration from law enforcement, but I acknowledge that it's kind of luck, honestly. Like, it's chance that we've had the particular alignment of individuals in their positions to facilitate the collaboration. So my first example, the Cardiff model, as we started it in Atlanta, started with DeKalb County PD. There was a sergeant who noticed there were a lot of burglaries taking place, and when he canvassed the community and had a discussion with them, oh, that happened twice last week, it was the same guy, and they hadn't been reporting it. And so in his effort to get a better understanding of what was going on and why the community wasn't reporting, found out about the Cardiff model, reached out to CDC and facilitated that. It was championed by law enforcement, which helped to facilitate it moving forward. In opposition to that, when we share how the Cardiff model works with other law enforcement departments, say the previous PD chief in Milwaukee, he was terribly opposed to the implementation of that model because of his perception that it would imply that the police department wasn't doing their job by uncovering this hidden subset of data, that the law enforcement department was ineffective. But the actual position of DeKalb is that it doesn't add to your bottom line. It gives you an understanding of what's going on, and you can do interventions that don't require more patrols, more salary, et cetera. So I think that law enforcement departments across the country, especially who have funding from this smart strategies for policing innovation, are wanting to affect change in a lot of important areas, but they're used to doing it siloed. They don't have the experience of collaborating with other agencies who share the motivation towards helping to address the same issues. And so that's made it challenging in other places where it hasn't for us. With regards to Pivot, working with law enforcement has been great for us and aligned in such a way that Chief Shields is very behind the implementation of Pivot, and our approach to collaborating with law enforcement in this way is that we are not deploying officers who perform arrests of any kind. They are community-oriented police officers who are basically sitting on the porch with grandma to help facilitate relationships to build trust and improve police legitimacy. And so we're just hoping through the partnerships that we have that have aligned so well, because it's totally likely that they would not come to the table on this issue, that we can utilize this to insert a voice of public health practice and perspective, and to support law enforcement officers in their natural work to address this issue.
Should we hear one last comment, please? It's in the very back. Yeah.
So, First of all, I'm from I lived in South Georgia for many years, and even when my son, before he got his hunting license, and they could get him like at 13 or whatever, it was mandated, and maybe it was a county ordinance, he